So what we're going to do now, in lieu of questions for this talk, is we're going to actually have a panel. And so I'll invite the panelists to come up to the stage, which includes you, Dr. Rosick. So take a step back. So we'll have Tanya Dorena, Hans Clark, Max Lepian, who have all been introduced. And then we have two additional panelists who we have yet to meet. So I'll give a brief introduction while everybody's coming on stage. Come. So first is Dr. Aristotle Voineskos. He's the Vice President of Research and Director of the Campbell Family Mental Health Research Institute at CAMH. He is a world-renowned scientist with his scientific impact ranging from brain mapping to clinical trials to scaling system-level initiatives in mental health care. He's published nearly 300 papers in leading journals of psychiatry, neurology, medicine, and neuroscience. He's a full professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto and holds a Canada Research Chair and also serves on the Scientific Council of the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. So welcome. And last but not least is Dr. Yuvraj. Yuvraj, I guess I know him colloquially because he was one of our fellows at the Transitional Pain Service, but he's much more than that now. So he's the director of the Acute Pain Service at Thunder Bay Regional Health Sciences Center. He's also an anesthesiologist and an interventional pain physician. Like I said, he was a fellow here and recently got a grant for a pilot program for a transitional pain service in Thunder Bay. So congratulations on that and welcome to the panel. So the way we're going to do this is anybody who has questions, feel free to come to the mic. I'll start us off. But what I really want is a conversation. We've had an amazing day. We've made it thus far in the day. And so what we want is something thought-provoking that we can sort of extract knowledge from the experts sitting in front of us today. So to start off with, we've heard a lot about the good work that's being done, both in the transitional pain service and beyond. But I want to ask each of you, what is next and what keeps you up at night? When you're thinking about chronic pain and the opioid crisis, what do you think the next steps are for each of you individually and as a system? So we'll start at the end, Dr. Rassett.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Hopefully I kind of addressed that in my second to last slide in my presentation. I think for us in Alberta, we just don't, quite frankly, have enough funding to have an actual standalone TPS in all the major hospitals. Like that's clear, like the funding is just not there. So I think we have to be a little bit innovative about how we try to deliver this care. What keeps me up at night is the fact that there's this huge pressure on the number of surgeries that we do, the push to increase those numbers, the fact that our population is increasing by 1 to 200,000 people per year. The population's growing, but yet it feels on the ground like our services are dwindling. That causes me some consternation for sure. So I am keen to kind of try and come up with some innovative models for how we can support this population. And it really worries me, like for us specifically, when we look at places like the South Zone, the part that's sort of Lethbridge, that area, like I think 60% of people in that zone do not have a family physician. So it's hard. I mean, these people come, they have their surgeries, they have no medical home to go back to, they have absolutely no follow-up care. The wait at the chronic pain clinic is lengthy. And so these people essentially are getting no service when it comes to pain. So that causes me to stare at the ceiling at night, some nights.
Max.
Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so what keeps you up at night? But what do you think is next in terms of the evolution of TPS and pain care in Canada?
Yeah, so I guess. So I think two things keep me up at night, one good thing and one bad thing. So I'll start with the bad one, and I think it's sustainability of some of the allied health parts of these multidisciplinary models. And this goes hand in hand with what Neves was saying about funding and funding availability. And the difficulty is I trained in the States, and there are very few advantages of the US healthcare system One of them is that psychologists, other allied health professionals bill insurance, and we don't here, right? And so we are a cost, and we're not a sustainable feature of many programs across Canada. But we are an evidence-based part of our programs and an important part of the programs. And so this kind of more narrowly focused on my discipline and adjacent disciplines, but how do we make that sustainable, and do we need systemic changes to make those kind of things sustainable? That's the scarier thing that keeps me up at night. The positive thing is that I think we have really exciting new directions for new interventions, whether it's in cannabis or psychedelic-assisted therapies, whether it's in new targets for psychological interventions, new drug targets. I think we have really interesting things that this is going to, in the next 10 years, we're going to see huge changes in how we can deal with this transition from acute to chronic pain and how we can prevent that.
What keeps me up at night, mostly, and what I see at TAPME, is that there's an issue with primary care, and that scares me with regards to ongoing care of the patient and what's going to happen. Since COVID, we've seen this slew of family physicians retire, and a lot of that generation of family docs was very comfortable in prescribing of opioids, and unfortunately the pendulum swung the opposite way with respect to opioids, that a lot of patients are being left in the lurch, or I'm refilling opioid prescriptions and blood pressure medications and acid reflux medications, because a lot of people who are on opioids are losing their family docs and then they can't get another one. And so they're missing that whole screening, like breast cancer screening, prostate cancer screening, just because they're on opioids and seen as maybe too complex to take on from a primary care perspective. That scares me as a chronic disease model, because we rely on the family physician for ongoing care. And so if we're taking on people with chronic disease, it doesn't leave room for new people. And so the system really gets bottlenecked because we don't have a place to put people after we've completed the program. That's a big issue for me, and I think I'll let the others talk. Thanks.
So just building on that point a little bit, I work in a specialty mental health hospital where a lot of our more severely mentally ill patients don't have primary care, and I also prescribe those kinds of medications, and that may be a little scary, given that I'm a psychiatrist. So, but there's no other option. But more generally speaking, I think a lot of our patients don't really have any proper physical health care, and I also know that even at a place like UHN, and these are two world-leading hospitals in their areas, a lot of patients with physical health problems don't have great mental health care, and as we just saw in the data, a lot of pain, there's underlying mental health conditions. So I think this service, and maybe other services like it, could be an answer, at least for more complex cases, to provide them with integrated mental and physical health care.
Yeah, thanks, Aristotle. So in terms of what keeps me up at night, or I guess the question is, where do you want the future to go? I think, we've tried to do so many things, and we've cast a wide net, but one of the things we still haven't really, really dug into is, what can we do acutely from an intervention standpoint with the patients? So we've done the psychological aspects, but there's a lot of the anesthesia literature, and my colleagues are always looking at me saying, well, what about these blocks, or what about these types of interventions, and what are their outcomes long term? And the reason those studies have always failed is they've taken healthy people before surgery. But we now have an opportunity to see those early patients that are struggling and start to intervene at that point. And so you have the population that you need to really see if you can affect those outcomes. I would say what's been really exciting for me is that with this opioid crisis and the death of OxyContin, we are finally seeing influx back into the pain world by industry and by pharma. And we have not had a drug make it to market for chronic pain in 2 decades, okay? We now have some headache drugs that have come in, some CGRP inhibitors that have come to the table. Those have been blockbuster drugs for patients suffering with headaches. We have 2 companies working on different molecules specifically for neuropathic pain and specifically for patients that are struggling with a lot of the types of things we're talking about today. And so I think in the next 10 years, we're going to actually move back to actually getting new therapies and new drugs that we can get to the market to help these folks that are struggling, because we have taken the big bad wolf off the table.
Thanks, Joanne, for giving this opportunity. And it's my honor and privilege to sit alongside the stalwarts of pain medicine. Answering the question, what keeps me awake in the night, Dr. Tanya Direna displayed a size of the Ontario. I live in Thunder Bay. If you look at northwest Ontario, which is equal to size of the France, with a population of 300,000. We have only 3 fellowship-trained pain physicians covering this much population. And one of our residents did an epidemiological study, and the data is yet to publish. And she found out, the results surprised me. The percentage of chronic pain population in northwestern Ontario is 25%, which is above the provincial average of Ontario, which is 18%. So coming here, I came to know a lot from Darlene and Jim, but I share a personal story from one of my friend nurse practitioner. She goes to Martin Falls, which is a First Nation reserve in the district of Kenora, where there is a population of less than 1,000, and there is no road access. She usually goes once in 1 week in a month, and she's the only nurse practitioner who goes there. There is no physician there, and whenever I meet her, she always shares a story that today I treated a patient with opioid overdose in the age like 20s to 30, and I have a chronic pain patient. Being worked with ANS, it made me to think, if any patient from that region undergoes surgery, who is going to monitor them for pain management or opioid weaning? So I discussed this with ANS over a dinner and wine, and he said, go and apply for a grant to make a data of your own. Then I did that. I got approved for the grant, and it got approved, but I don't know where to start and how to start. What I have now with me is one pain physician who is interested to do transitional pain service, and 1.5 my acute pain service nurse practitioner. And the Hans mentioned like the triad of transitional pain services: psychotherapy, physical medicine, and medication intervention. But there is no psychologist in Thunder Bay, so I'm kind of stuck. But after coming here, I got so many opportunity or option like self-management tool from Tagir, and then I like to collaborate with Dr. Azik. Like we are kind of in a similar situation. She's ahead of me to use some of her care model to implement in Thunder Bay.
Great. If there are any other questions, please come up. But one thing that came up from a lot of the responses was this idea of funding and resources, right? And we all know that resources are scarce and we have to make decisions. And so, we all see the benefits of programs like this because we work and see the effects on our patients. But what do you think the next step is in terms of convincing other people to fund these sorts of programs in this society or system where we're competing for everything? So money comes to TPS, but it's going to take away from another program such as cancer screening.
Sometimes not relying on just a single source of funding, and Hans had brought up that part about bringing industry back. We made this terrible association between industry and pain, but at some level, it could be valuable to seek funding sources to help support programming. And then, when you put the patient at the center, there's always this fundraising and philanthropy ability to focus and highlight what transitional pain services do for people and how they can change their trajectory. So using that as a potential funding source. So not just thinking about funding from ministry sources, but getting a bit more creative with how we look for it.
So I'm all in with Tanya's suggestion, but if we look at the slides that JF put up earlier today, there is a big stimulus of cash in this budget that was put out there. And so if you see value in specific areas, this is new money, so no one has to be threatened. And so how do you advocate for the pain space? How do you advocate for the mental health and pain space with this new bucket of funding? And so if we even think about, research funding, because this is going to be a big discussion next week at our National Pain Congress, and think about this. So we fund, or the chronic pain costs Canada $47 to $65 billion annually. We fund pain at a 5% rate of all research operating funds. So an entity that's costing us more than heart disease, diabetes, and HIV combined is getting 5% of research funding. We hit a peak after the action plan on pain, 8%. But we very rapidly are back at 5%. So we've got a new stimulus of money. Pain needs a home. It doesn't have a home. It lives in osteoarthritis. It lives in mental health. It lives in all of these other immunomodulatory diseases. It lives in all of these other spaces except its own space. We've been talking about this for years. It's time for pain to have its own space.
Aristotle, just to follow up on that, Hans alluded to the fact that psychiatry gets a lot of resources and pain doesn't for research.
That's it's some good artistic liberty. But, mental health is also underfunded from a research point of view. So, it could be like the one group robbing from the other, essentially. But another way to think about what Hans says, you can have your own area, which is fine, but you could also actually use pain integrates with everything. So it's, a different side of the same coin where there's opportunity in every area to get funding from a pure research point of view. From a more service-oriented point of view, like a tactic we've used, which requires less funding to implement and scale models of care across the province, was really about retraining and upskilling staff, which costs a lot less than asking for net new staff of all kinds of allied health professional backgrounds, which I think can be helpful, because there's things people can do even if they don't have the exact health professional certified background that I think is a lot better than nothing. So that's yet another sort of tool in the toolbox I think people can consider.
Great. One of the comments I heard during one of the breaks was, this is all great, but it's overwhelming. There's so many things that seem amazing that I would want to implement in my hospital, but I don't know where to begin. And in particular, the psychology piece came up for an acute pain service at a hospital. Most people didn't even know that psychologists could see inpatients after surgery, and to you, that's sort of the status quo, but for someone working in even an academic hospital, that's unheard of. And so, Max in particular for the psychology piece, but for all of you, for someone looking at this and being in awe, where do you think they should begin?
So I'll start with that. I think understanding what a psychologist is going into the room to do for a patient is kind of where we can start, because a lot of the things we do are common factors things, as we'd call them, right? We establish rapport with patients, we validate their experiences, we provide trauma-informed care, and we then also do our case conceptualization and use our psychological interventions. But those first pieces are critical. And I think that's something that any care provider anywhere can, to use the term, upskill to really not just be an empathic person because we're all working in healthcare and hopefully we are caring people that want to go in and help, but to understand what does it actually mean to have a validating communication with somebody. How can I reflect that? And those aren't things that take long necessarily to learn, but they can make an enormous difference in establishing rapport with patients at the bedside.
I'm going to echo that comment. I think it is totally overwhelming. Like, I 100% agree. I think that pain is everywhere, but like very few people own it. It's a really, really challenging area. There's no question about it. And Hans is right. It doesn't have a home, hasn't had a home, and it's really hard when you're homeless. I think if you want to start a project at your local institution or clinic or whatever, having started several at the Alberta Children's Hospital, I think one of the keys is to get champions. If you can get a surgeon or a nurse practitioner or a physiotherapist or psychologist, someone who really shares your vision. And if you can get top down, bottom up, if you can get some buy-in from leadership and some buy-in from those who are delivering service, then I think that is the secret sauce to getting something done. Start small, don't try and boil the ocean, start with something small, get your champions, get the buy-in, and get going. I think that's the easiest way to start.
And let's be clear, I'm overwhelmed. Like, just even like all of the information that came at us today, you know, every one of these speakers that were chosen created their own talks. And even I was learning information for the first time in some of these talks. And so to be honest with you, start with what the tools are that you have. Add one cog to that piece, as Neva says, get those champions, collect the data, and start to show that what you're doing is either making a difference or not. And then institutions will listen. And so start small. You don't have to have all these pieces. We didn't. We had one piece, we got another piece, and then we just continued to add to it.
Answering to that question, my nurse practitioner is I already mentioned there is no psychologist, but my nurse practitioner is so motivated, and she completed a pain reprocessing therapy, and then she's so eager to go maybe to on-site and see what's happening, like shadow the psychology team and happening, and she might take the role of a psychologist in my team if in the future.
This idea of using like one-on-one care for everybody is probably not going to work. So I think that step model approach where we can use virtual tools, apps, and your modules that you made with Pain Canada, I think doing that as an initial step might be a good way to go. And then when you collect the data, you're probably going to identify that there's gaps that certain people can't use these because English is not their second language, reading technology availability, and then kind of looking at how you can cater towards that particular vulnerable population or equity-seeking population, equity-deserving population. I think that's probably the way to go. So kind of virtual stuff first to help everybody, and then maybe looking at where the one-on-one is necessary.
Question at the microphone.
I'd like to add to the overwhelming aspect of this. There are lots of interesting potential innovations. We just heard about the possibility that pharmaceutical companies are developing lots of potential novel interventions. But to get those into practice, you have to do a clinical trial. I've looked at last week at the number of clinical trials involved in chronic pain in Toronto. In the clinicaltrials.gov site, there's 30. If I look at cancer in Ontario, there's 800 trials open. So I think if you're going to really approach industry or implement a lot of these new ideas, you have to have a robust clinical trial system. Pharma really wants something that's already set up. They don't want you to say, oh, I know I can get 20 sites. They want to see 20 sites working right now. So it's just I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I was encouraged by Hans' comment this morning that there is a clinical trial network on the drawing board. I would urge you to implement it as quickly as possible.
And so thank you for the comment, because it feeds into, maybe I'll give my chief a plug. So he, one of K-Van's big babies, or one of his babies, is to build in a clinical trial unit within our department. And so we've done that, and we have the capability, and it's actually enabling us to move some of these other things forward. And your point is very valid. I think it's something Kareem talked about when he came here from the US, that there's chronic pain is a space where we just don't have trial data. And how do we create that so that we can push some of these interventions forward that we know have value, or we at least think have value? We don't know until the work's done. And so I think the next 10 years, that's really one of the exciting things. We are developing, and like you said, we are developing with this clinical trial network that we have the opportunity to build. We already have about 10 sites across the country ready to go. So if we can get to the place where we have the possible intervention and we have the funding, and maybe it comes from industry, maybe it comes from wherever, that we could actually start to do these things in Canada and drive some of these things forward. So your point's well taken. Thanks for that.
Aristotle, just not to pick on you again, but
I'm getting used to it. It's
well,
good.
you know,
It's good.
but in reality, I think one of the things we look at is psychiatry as a model, because psychiatry has been so successful at attracting industry funding and, you know, doing clinical trials. You look at something like ketamine that's been used for chronic pain for a while. You look at how many trials have been done for ketamine for depression, it's an order of magnitude more than what's been done for chronic pain. And wondering if you have any insights, you know, from your role, just to share.
I love hearing this perspective on psychiatry. Like, as an insider, doesn't feel that way when we're inside about success. We always feel like we're the orphans. So, I mean, that whole class of medicines is kind of relatively new, and it's certainly led to a bit of a resurgence in pharmacological trials, because in the first decade of the century and halfway through the second, like, there was a huge decline. It kind of in a way preceded, I think, the same issues that you guys faced with pain medications, and now I think things are scaling back up again. You know, I think we were talking about this last night a little bit. There's still some more data that needs to come out to really have a sense if some of these, you know, different action medications actually work, you know, in terms of needing to study thousands of people first before really concluding that these are great options. But given, I think, what we've seen with the overlap of things like depression and pain, it would stand to reason that there may be, like, you know, something like a similar mechanism of action for both kinds of conditions and a lot of overlap. And certainly the brain circuitry of physical pain and emotional pain is pretty closely linked. So I think that you know, I'm a big fan of mechanistic trials, to not just see if something works, but to understand why it works. And I think that could be a great way to start in this field, where you don't need to study hundreds of thousands of people. You can study 20, 40 people initially, and also look at the mechanism of action of the medication, as well as early symptom improvement. And then if that plays out, then you would, I think, attract funding to do larger scale trials.
Awesome.
I see Mickey's at the mic, but I just want to jump into that because it reminds me of your talk earlier today, when you had all these thousands of people up on the screen, but then you have your individual patient there, and the overlap of the mechanisms of action. I think when we saw Graham's story with the ketamine story, and I have some patients that'll come in and they'll have a ketamine infusion. I don't think it's touching their pain, but they say, oh, I felt great for 2 or 3 weeks, and it was more of a mood effect. And so, you know, understanding what those overlapping mechanisms are going to be huge to see where we land.
Absolutely. So, Mickey, you're going to ask the last question of the session, so no pressure.
Before getting to my question, I just want to acknowledge the comment from the gentleman before me. Hans was speaking about not a chronic pain clinical trial network, but a cannabis-specific clinical trial network. But thank you for clarifying there are other networks happening. My question is around a few times today we heard not having enough resources and you know, the one-on-one model not being you know, feasible as the only way forward, and pointing to technology, which I think is fabulous. I believe that I didn't hear one person mention peer-to-peer support or peer support, and I'm just wondering, maybe I missed something, or can someone speak to that as its own, you know, the effectiveness of that potentially for chronic pain patients, with or without a combination of technology as well, right? So we know CBT, for example, works better when there's someone to coach someone through it, right? Than just rather than just reading the materials on their own. So that's my comment, is around peer support.
I can go for it. So I think peer support's an incredibly important tool that we have to take advantage of. And it's one of those things that goes along with upskilling. As many people are willing and able to get involved and do this kind of work, I think from an evidence perspective, we need more research on it, in particular, as an evidence-based strategy for pain management. And I think it needs to be integrated, as with many of these things, in stepped care models of how we are delivering interventions and how we're reaching the people who need the interventions most, the most complex patients, and how they're getting streamed to those most intensive one-on-one individual therapies, whereas for others, a peer support group might be 100% effective, right? And how do we find those? And I know at TapMe, you guys are working on that. We've been working on that, and it's a question of accumulating enough data so that we can see kind of how do we really streamline these people and how do we really fit the right treatment to the right person at the right time.
Tony?
Just for peer support, I don't want people to forget about the People in Pain Network that belongs to Pain Canada, with tons of peers that are available. And there's peer support networks that happen twice a week. And you can find that through the Power Over Pain portal. There's your plug, yet. Power Over Pain portal. So,
Hans, you want to give some concluding remarks?
So it's 4:17, so we failed you at 4:18, but we promised to be done at 4:15. So I just want to say thank you. I mean, there's no point in putting a meeting on like this unless people show up to have the dissemination part of the get the knowledge disseminated. And so this was one of the mandates of our SUAP funding. I think we have delivered on that, and the fact that you're here means that what we're doing and the work is of interest to you. We will continue to do the work, and if we are here 10 years from now, as everyone says, I promise there will be a social event after the meeting. So for tonight, again, thank you very much. It's really been our honor to have you here, and I am so thankful to all the speakers, all of my colleagues, everybody that has shown up, and everybody that continues to participate in this work that really is not about us. It's about the patients, it's about Sid, it's about Graham, it's about continuing to improve the lives of the Canadians living with chronic pain. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.